Something about this theory has been a bit hard to write. Not because of the subject matter being tough or having to write it while away at VidCon, which has been an absolute blast by the way, but because I've got to take a stance and actually disagree. If you hadn't noticed by now, FNaF theorizing isn't a battle between you and Scott Cawthon. After all, he's retired and largely stayed out of the conversation for a while, be it for better or worse. No, these days it's a battle between you and MatPat, who, whether it be a good thing or not, you can agree is seen by a majority of people as where most of FNaF lore's baseline beliefs come from. There are always going to be a few stark outliers like Golden Freddy never existing, which is honestly just funny to say in retrospect. But you do have to admit, FNaF game theories anywhere from solving the blob to Gregory being a robot do develop their own sort of followings anyways, which leads us back to why this video was so hard to write in the first place, being that I've got to take one of those theory beliefs some might hold as a default and pull it up by the roots before it digs in too deep. And that one happens to be the most recent one. On which one that might be, we'll get there. So first, let's set the stage. To hold over till the release of Ruin later this month, theorists have had to turn to Five Nights at Freddy's series Tales from the Pizzaplex to get our fill, and oh boy does it have a lot to dwell on. So far, the series has given us stories about the indie dev, Gregory, inexplicable Phasant anime girls, and no less than 11 stories directly within the Pizzaplex, per the name Tales from the Pizzaplex, though I think right there is where a lot of people are getting caught up. The series establishes early that there are multiple pizzaplexes, some probably a bit smaller or differently built, but pizzaplexes nonetheless, which begs the question of which pizzaplex we are being shown in Tales. If you didn't know, most of those 11 or so stories within the pizzaplex feature one or more specific attractions that appear in other Tales stories. So, if you take each story and connect them by their overlapping attractions, you get something like this. A mess to be sure, but definitely more organized than we ever got with Fazbear Fright. For example, two of the most important stories for creating this web of tales was Cleithrophobia and Under Construction, which both go way more in depth than anyone could have asked for on describing attractions around the Pizzaplex, even denoting an entire section to doing just that at the very beginning of the story. By tracking these attractions throughout the stories and making educated guesses on what attractions might have been removed after incidents involving them, we can actually make a pretty solid timeline on what the progression of this Pizzaplex might have looked like. To keep it brief, the Pizzaplex launched with just under 11 distinct attractions, with almost all of them being removed for one reason or another over time. Now, if you pause to take a peek at that list, you might have noticed not a single attraction that's familiar to the actual Pizzaplex in Security Breach, with a lot of theorists picking up on that too. Technically, if we judge each Pizzaplex how we see them most, the only similarities they've got are the arcades, gift shops, and food vendors, which is just junk every mall needs. So what's going on with these two distinct Pizzaplexes? Well, most might have assumed that after Fazbear Fright, this web of tales is another set of parallels to the games. Two alternate pizzaplexes both depicting similar events that might help us figure out what's happening in the games. And when I said most might have assumed, I meant most. You can check out Game Theory, Fudge On, ID's Fantasy, Rytoast. They're all saying the same thing, that this web of tales is meant to parallel and elaborate on the games, spilling details on some overarching story, but I don't think that's really the case. Before I get into the big point on why, let's take a peek into one of Tales' most interesting stories, the Bobby Dots, which unlike any other story is divided across two books. Here's a fun fact for you. The Pizzaplex depicted in the Bobby Dots matches the game's Pizzaplex 110%, and when I say that, I mean it. In its two stories, the Bobby Dots managed to depict Fazerblast, Monty Golf, the sewers, the kitchens, the unused utilidors, DJ Music Man getting handsy in the arcade, a reference to the Fazerblast jam song in Security Breach's soundtrack, a complete untold backstory for the daycare attendant and the theater, Glamrock Mr. Hippo and his recalled item magnets, and even Bonnie Bowl with the exact same number of lanes as in Security Breach. And even if that didn't convince you that the Bobby Dots happens at the Security Breach Pizzaplex, consider that the story was not only originally written with scrapped content from Security Breach like the alien staff bots in Fazerblast, but actively had the story revised before launch to match that much closer to the looks of the Pizzaplex present in Security Breach. So, even if you don't end up caring about the main takeaway of this theory later down the line, at least walk away knowing that the Bobby Dots is definitely 110% in the game's timeline, basically spoon-fed to us. So why don't we dive deeper into the web of tales now that that's over? At this point, I think most theorists would agree on the following statement. Security Breach is the main timeline, meanwhile Tales depicts a parallel timeline with a parallel Pizzaplex. Definitely not the same one dedicated to, well, parallels. I know I'm full of fun facts today, but you can actually nail down what stories are important to this web of tales by who wrote them. A majority of Tales' interconnected Pizzaplex stories have been masterminded by Andrea Wagner. Meanwhile, Kelly Parra and Ellie Cooper covered the majority outside the Pizzaplex. Minus the Bobby Dots, here's a list of Andrea Wagner's total stories so far, and here is a list of total stories stuck on the web. And if you're paying attention to those two lists, you'd notice that there's one more outlier besides the Bobby Dots that doesn't exactly fit like you'd expect. Everyone's favorite story, GGY, was perhaps one of Tales' most surprising stories, giving us not only insight into what was up with GGY on all the arcade games, but also what exactly happened to the therapists, with Gregory revealed to be Patient 46, luring them to their deaths in the Pizzaplex when they got too close to the truth. Now, I'd actually be quite interested to see how theorists like to use this story, as well as another similar story, Help Wanted. In Tales, so far there have been 3 individual stories with extremely close ties to the games, those being Bobby Dots, which we already covered, but also GGY and Help Wanted. While the Bobby Dots didn't have too much big info to dump on us, GGY and Help Wanted are 110% meant to solve large mysteries set forward since around as far back as Help Wanted. They act as complete, comprehensive answers with no problems or complications to the main timeline, and for that reason, I'd be interested to see whether people still try to treat them as parallels or not. On one hand, I don't understand why someone would treat them as parallels considering they are both 110% games lore and in fact continuity compliant, so it would be an unnecessary step to strip mine them of their answers but determine them as less important than a game's events might be. On the other hand, for those who think they are entirely canonical with the games, I've got something just a bit interesting to share. I'm assuming at this point we can agree the Bobby Dots, Help Wanted, and GGY are all canonical to the games. That's an easy conclusion. Well, if you're both someone who just got convinced of that and already believed in parallels, and make sure not to backtrack on this, I just convinced you that a story is simultaneously within the game's timeline and the web of tales. Let me explain. Earlier in the video, I might have lied a bit about GGY, or at least withheld a bit of info. What you didn't know is that GGY mentions both a high-tech roller coaster and climbing tubes, both distinct and objective attractions in the web of Tales. GGY is the connector between Tales and the games. After all, you can't argue GGY isn't in the game's timeline, and it would be flat out unnecessary for this to be some random Pizzaplex in the games. So like it or not, the web of Tales is in the game's timeline. Something I tend to notice is that the majority of theorists aren't misinformed into thinking Tales aren't canonical, but more so they just don't want them to be, which is really strange to me. If you're into the franchise enough to be a theorist, then why turn down perfectly good canon material? Of course, not all of it's gonna crack the identity of Golden Freddy or open the box, but we love a good addition to the canon, even if it's small. In terms of how these two distinctly different Pizzaplexes turn out to be one and the same, it's not a difference of timeline, but a difference of time itself. After all, Security Breach itself has shown that the Pizzaplex has changed quite a bit over time, like how it used to have real human employees before replacing them all with staff bots. Tales just depicts a much older era of the Pizzaplex's history, even featuring what it looked like when it first launched. Like I showed earlier, the Web of Tales contains a very specific timeline of attractions being added and removed. And wouldn't it be a waste to actually write all that out if these were just parallels to the games? It's like the old FNaF 4 game theory. These stories could be a completely different Pizzaplex with honestly very little parallel material to begin with, but that would be really lame and wouldn't make sense being alongside stories with such massive reveals. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't parallels. FNAF's always had thematic parallels, from Follow Me and the MCI to FNAF 4 and also the MCI, but that doesn't mean it's not all in the same timeline. And thus, there are even a few pretty big ones within canonical stories, but most of the time you'll find your canonical stories interconnected and your parallel stories to be pretty separate. A good source of those in Tales might be more of the stories by Kelly Parra and Ellie Cooper, like with Submechanophobia, which is basically the same sort of premise as the original FNAF in a different setting. One specific argument I hear often against Tales, as an attraction example, is why isn't the Baobab tree still front and center in the Pizzaplex? And to answer that, a lot of the attractions just got removed before the events of Security Breach. Remember, most of these stories are specifically depicting what went wrong with each attraction, especially the baobab tree which caused the deaths of 2 Fazbear higher-ups, and was in fact later removed in the story Tiger Rock. Remember, Tales isn't not canon because it doesn't connect. We just don't have all the information yet, and considering Tales 7 was just delayed to around after Ruin, Tales has something big up its sleeve that could crack the Pizzaplex wide open. The series has always been Tales from the Pizzaplex after all. Also, for you Tales diehards, don't worry about the Mimic. It totally works and we'll be saving it for another day. Also, I know about Scholastic and Barnes deliberately saying Tales is canon. I just felt like there were better ways of convincing people than getting semantic with what Scott or some book company has said. In the end, if there are some big things I want you to walk away with, it's that the Web of Tales is in the game's timeline, Tales shows how the Pizzaplex used to be and how it's changed over time, and to pay close attention to Andrea Wagner's future additions to the mythos of Security Breach. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Gonna rush this outro a bit since I've got a few days left at VidCon and want to make the most of it, so I hope you all enjoyed, and here's to another round of theory videos. After all, who the frick cares about an audiobook, am I right? Take care, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.